and welcome to H2O Global News' stream series. I'm Natasha, a writer here at H2O Global News, and today I'm joined by Vishnu, Senior Manager of Treatment Growth and Strategy at Xylem. We'll be talking about what's changing in industrial wastewater treatment and how companies are adapting to tighter regulations, limited space, and the push towards modular solutions. Hi Vishnu, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, Natasha. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be able to join you today, and I hope that I can shed some light on some of the challenges that industries are facing today, especially when it comes to managing their wastewater.
Thank you. Would you just be able to start by telling us a little bit about your role at Xylem?
Yeah, I can. So, my name is Vishnu. I'm based out of Xylem's Paris office. I work in a predominantly commercial role, though it's cross-functional. It's one of the exciting things about Xylem's merger with the workforce. So, we've been able to expand our portfolio of wastewater treatment solutions, especially.
Thank you. So now I'd like to start by asking you what's changing in the industrial wastewater world, thinking about the different pressures and the regulations, space and cost. I know you work closely with lots of different industrial sites across Europe. So what are you seeing at the moment when it comes to changes in wastewater treatment?
Yeah, that's a broad question. Regulation is definitely number one, top of mind for our customers because, especially in Europe, regulation has been tightening. So you've got the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive and the Industrial Emissions Directive. Those are the two main ones off the top of my head. I consider them as two sides of the same coin because even though the wastewater treatment directive addresses municipal treatment plants, it does place restrictions on them in terms of effluent quality that they discharge. But then the knock-on effect of that is it has an impact on what they're willing to accept, especially from their industrial end users that discharge into those treatment plants, right? Similarly, if you go upstream to industrial end users, you have the tightening industrial emissions directive in Europe, which also places restrictions on the discharge quality, like the effluent quality that they can discharge downstream. It has impacts on the permitting process. It has obligations for industrial customers to report, to monitor, and so on. And the revision also gave more teeth for enforcing those regulations for authorities. So, as I said, it's both regulations are two sides of the same coin. So that's putting a lot of pressure on industrial end users when it comes to managing their wastewater. Of course, cost is an important consideration, right? So, but then when we think about cost, right, when our customers think about cost, it is done within the framework of the regulatory requirements, right? Because compliance is table stakes, it's mandatory, right? So the cost optimization happens within that framework, right? So if um, the technology that is under consideration is not addressing their need for being compliant, then irrespective of the cost differential, then that wouldn't be the one that they would go for, right? So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah.
And space again is another factor that is quite important in Europe. So these are differences with different markets, right? So our end customers in industries in North America, for example, they are not as space constrained as we are in Europe, right? So, it's the old continent and it's for a reason, right? So we have the space that we have, right? And we have to optimize. So that's definitely something that is beneficial for end customers, right? So if you have a more effective solution in terms of land use, so that's something that we see. Um, and and then water scarcity is again a broad theme now that is becoming more important. So certain parts of Europe go through long periods of drought. And typically, the south of Europe is what stands out for people when we think about impacts of climate change in Europe. Not necessarily the case because the Nordics, surprisingly, also goes through long periods of droughts. That tells me that global climate change is actually quite global. So that's again, securing water supplies is increasingly going to be important for industrial and customers as well. So I know that's a broad theme, lots of different aspects. So if you want to dig deeper into some of those areas, then we can take a look
Yeah,
at that.
I was also wondering how much of the pressure is kind of the regulatory versus how much of it is the capacity and the cost. Um,
Mm.
yeah, if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things I touched in my earlier answer regarding the different, I'd say, variables that our customers have to optimize for,
Mhm.
the most important of those variables is compliance, right? Because I'll give you certain examples of industries, right? So when we look at regulations now, you've got EPR coming in, though, in customers in cosmetics and pharma are actually litigating against what the EU Commission wants to put in place, but we'll see what happens with that. But then EPR is going to come in some shape or form, right? Whether it's this form, we don't know yet. No, it might be tweaked, but if that is the case, then it is going to be difficult for customers in those industries to be able to discharge like they used to in the past, right? So the cost of being non-compliant is way higher than actually investing in the technologies to make sure that you're compliant, right? So I would say regulation is table stakes for certain types of end users. That's the key driver. But then if you look at some other industries, right, let's say industries where water is a key ingredient in their production process, for those ones, reuse could increasingly become very important, right? Because securing water supply is going to be critical for them. So over a period of time, you would see reuse becoming an emerging theme for those customers, right? So it depends on what is the key imperative, depending on the industry, and that varies. But then compliance is going to be important, securing supplies is going to be important. And within those two boxes, you would see customers trying to find the least expensive solution to reduce the operational and regulatory risks, right? That's how I would put it.
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, it's really interesting. And there's obviously a lot of different factors that are at play and a lot of different factors that influence people's decisions and yeah, ultimately the best decision for them. Leading on from the talking about the different pressures, I think maybe now we could talk about what that means in practice. So some of the solutions, when that space is limited and regulations are tightening, what kind of treatment solutions are the industrial customers actually turning to, and what can you offer at Xylem?
So, what are the solutions to those problems, right? So, depending on where a particular site is in its life cycle, if it's a greenfield facility, then obviously you have more options because you can design for reuse, or you can design for um, compliance or tightening compliance from the very beginning, right? So that's an advantage from that perspective. But if you are a brownfield site, you already have an existing treatment train which was designed for a different, compliance regime or different production capacity, for example, then your choices are a bit more constrained, right? So one of the things that we see customers turning to in that kind of a scenario is going to more decentralized or modular treatment solutions because they give multiple advantages. From a space standpoint, definitely it's a huge advantage because with a modular system, you can configure the installation of a treatment train in different ways, right? That fits your space limitations. Um, For example, in the case of our own portfolio, we do have modular systems that span across the different stages of wastewater treatment, right? All the way from clarification to post polishing, right? Our objective has been to be able to deliver mobile treatment trains to customers, be it for reuse, be it for improved discharge, quality. And it's not only us that that is seeing that shift. Our competitors are seeing that shift, right? The market adapts to what customers want at the end of the day, right? So from that perspective, that is a real need in Europe. So having modularity, being able to expand your capacity when you need it, that is a big value driver for end customers. So I would say that's from where we stand at this point in time, given the constraints we have. I think those would be the best options, right, for brownfield sites to look at.
Yeah, moving towards the modular and the biofilm-based systems, it's interesting because they're obviously very different to the traditional approaches, aren't they? And yeah, you spoke about a lot of the benefits. Are there any other benefits that you want to add on to that?
Yes. So modular biofilm treatment, like when we talk about aerobic wastewater treatment, right? Historically, we've had a lot of fixed, infrastructure technologies. Think about activated sludge. That was predominantly the technology of choice. Say 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago. One of the issues with that, especially when this is not regarding a specific technology, right? When you talk about building out permanent infrastructure, there are always trade-offs, right? When it comes to modular systems, one of the disadvantages of building out permanent infrastructure is you will have to design for future capacity in mind, right? Especially when you have space limitations, then you cannot design for the capacity needs of today, right? So it, it is critical. Otherwise, then you'd be left with stranded infrastructure down the line, which you wouldn't know how to manage, right? So you don't want to be in this situation. That leads to increased cost for sure, right? Because you will have to oversize whatever solution that you want to go for. One of the other drawbacks with climate change, and I've linked this to climate change, is that in the past, when we could baseline demand better, when the climate situation was more stable, then we could reliably oversize. But today, that's not really an easy task to do because with the change in climate, you can't really forecast demand as well, right? So then you'll have to oversize, but you don't know what size you want to target, right? So that makes it difficult. The advantage of modular systems and biofilm-based systems are one of them, right? So you do see modularity spanning across the entire portfolio these days, is that you can add capacity when you need it, right? So it takes that burden off of you in having to figure something out that you don't know what that future state is going to be, right? So that gives you a lot of flexibility. And it also gives you flexibility in terms of technology deployments, because once you build out permanent capital infrastructure, it's very hard to change it, right? Because it's meant to be permanent. So if technology improves, you want to do something else, then it becomes difficult. With a modular decentralized approach, then that gives you more flexibility in terms of being able to do that, right? So if you have improved treatment technology, then you can see how you want to incorporate it, within the existing constraints of your site. And the other benefit of modularity is that it reduces single points of failure, right? So let's say you have a permanent capital infrastructure. Let's take an MBBR, right? It's a permanent, and take an example of an MBBR. It's a permanent install. There's one large MBBR reactor on site, And then if that goes down, so what? No, you are in trouble, right? So you have to shut down your production. You have to figure out a way to quickly repair. Maybe you need to bypass the water, like until you carry out repairs, right? So that's an issue. When you have decentralized systems, so you could have one reactor go down. Maybe you won't have 100% capacity, but you don't have zero capacity either, right? So it's more resilient from that standpoint, right? So you reduce single points of failure if you go to a decentralized approach. So I would say those are, and scalability, we spoke about it earlier, right? So it's also scalable based on your demand. So even from a CapEx outlay perspective, like it's scalable, with your demand. So it matches like your cost with your production, so better. So that's helpful. I would say those are also very important, say, benefits of modular approaches to wastewater treatment.
I wanted to ask a bit more about the financial aspects of it. So, how do the modular treatment systems change the financial situation for the industrial operators, particularly when comparing like the capital expenditure and the operational expenditure, when you compare that against the more conventional installations?
One additional factor, which I forgot to mention in my earlier response, when you can go to a modular, decentralized approach for like wastewater treatment, even clean water production, right? The advantage it confers to you is that you don't have to necessarily buy the capital. You can buy outcomes because in a sense, you can go to an outcome-based model with a contractor saying, I want to have a certain quality of effluent, right? Or I want to have a certain quantity of produced water, right? And you can convert your CapEx outlay that you historically had to an OPEX, like, spend more easily than you would be able to do with a permanent infrastructure, because the permanent infrastructure does not give you that flexibility or does not give an operator that flexibility, right? So that is another aspect of the managing capital and what approach you take, right? And we see it increasingly now, less so in Europe at this stage, though I wouldn't say it's like it's completely new. In North America, for example, from our experience in Xylem, we have a lot of operational contracts with our end customers in the industrial space, right? And then the advantages, your cost as as an end customer is tied to specific metrics, volumes, right? Volumes produced, volumes treated, and so on. And it's easier for the operator to also manage that, with the modular approach, right? So you add additional treatment capacity when it's needed. And this is not something new to, I mean, this is not something new to how end customers contract anyway, right? If you think about computing, right, I'll give that as an example, a counterpoint. If you look at computing, 25, 30 years ago, everyone bought hardware, right? So no one was buying computing power, right? So that's completely flipped now, right? Everyone's buying computing power. No one buys the hardware. And from a water context, that is also something that you would increasingly see down the line, right? So it's not right now, right? We are not at an inflection point, but the decentralized approach and the modularity of systems gives a great, I'd say, tailwind to that kind of a shift happening down the line.
It does really just explain, I think, how important those different solutions are, and yeah, just the time that we're in at the moment, these shifts that everybody is making to these new and improved solutions that will hopefully improve every way that they work. But each
And
situation is so different, of course. But
yeah, absolutely. And optimizing capital, right? That's again something that's going to be important, right? So like some of the things we spoke about earlier in terms of harder to predict like what capacity you need to aim for, right? So that makes it difficult to understand what should be your ideal CapEx spend, right? So how much should you design for? how should you size it? How much do you oversize it? Um, when it is that kind of a situation, then it's easier if you can tie your capital spend to what capacity you need at a given point in time, right? So that gives you more certainty in terms of cash flows. The operational aspect is also interesting, because typically when you talk about modular systems, it does help you to reduce your operational cost in a certain way. Maybe not directly in terms of cash flows, but in terms of better outcomes. Reason why I say that is, if you look historically, right? We took the example of like a large permanent install. You have a failure, then that's a single point of failure. In a decentralized approach, you always have capacity, right? So that's a big operational outcome that you can get, right? In terms of making this kind of a shift. Um, you you can always swap units out easily and get back to 100% capacity, right? So like if it's modular, then it's easy to remove something and put an identical system in place while you fix a broken unit, for example. Now, so that gives you that flexibility as well from an operational standpoint. So it reduces downtime. It increases like service intervals as well, in a certain way, right? Because you can run your production facility for, especially for customers for whom production capacity is important, right? If water or wastewater is critical to their process, if it goes down, they'll have to shut down. Then in that kind of scenario, that is really important for customers, right? So it does have a big impact on the capital and operational spend profile for customers.
Okay, well, that moves us on nicely to our final section. So let's discuss a little bit about on-site reuse and future-proofing industrial water management. So beyond compliance, why is on-site reuse of treated wastewater becoming more important for industrial facilities, and what are the benefits?
Reuse is becoming more important now, especially with water scarcity being a real thing, right? So reuse is what we are seeing, with reuse is that it's moving from just being a PowerPoint presentation to actual operational imperatives for customers, right? So um, because securing water supply is critical for any industrial customer, right? Whether water is part of their core input, production process, or it's used mainly for subsystems, but which are still critical, right? And you think of cooling systems in industrial facilities, they consume a lot of water. Managing that water is important. So securing non-portable or portable, like ideally, if you are able to secure portable water reuse as a customer, especially if water is an important part of the production process, then that's the ideal situation, right?
Yeah.
The other aspect to it is tied to wastewater, right? Because reuse forces you, from a design standpoint, to aim for improved quality, right? Effluent quality. So which that has a knock-on effect on the volume of wastewater that you produce, that you have to manage, and it facilitates um, permitting, right? Renewing your permits and so on, because you reduce the volume of like wastewater that you have to manage, right? So your compliance issues are simplified in a certain way. In some cases, you might produce more concentrated wastewater, so it's the volume that you reduce, but obviously you will still have to take care of the concentrated wastewater. But having a lower volume is always better than having a larger volume that you will have to manage, right? So it has that knock-on effect on wastewater as well, right? So from that standpoint, reuse is really important. For customers increasingly in Europe.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, so important. I think, yeah, the reuse aspect of it all, I can see that it's only going to become more important as well as the years go on. So
Uh,
a big
uh,
topic, I'm sure.
yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Natasha.
Yeah.
One of the things, to conclude this, right now, I think you were asking about future proofing, what industrial customers should be thinking about, right? If we conclude, with that, what we are seeing in our discussions with end customers is that customers increasingly are looking at water, procuring water, or procuring like treatment services for managing wastewater, like they would do for other processes that they don't own end to end today. We spoke a little bit about computing, right? So customers don't own their computing requirements necessarily these days, right? They find the right vendor to manage it for them. Similarly, if you think about logistics for any industrial customer, right, they don't typically own these days the logistics end to end. So you've got specialized vendors who provide those services for customers, right? And this is not core for an industrial customer, right? So they have their core competency, their production process that they specialize in. And what we see progressively is moving into the same realm as these other, say, services. So outsourced water services is something that we see progressively being something that is important to customers, because then it would take the burden of management of wastewater from a customer, and you get them to work with some trusted partners on whom they can then offload that, I would say, operational capability slash risk, right? So then it's no longer a risk that they own and they have to manage. Then it's someone else's risk that who probably is better at managing that, because that's their core competency, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that is something that I would say, from a future perspective, could be where we are headed towards down the line.
Thank you, Vishnu. That, yeah, takes us to the end of our conversation. But I just want to say thank you very much for your time and just for sharing your knowledge with, yeah, us and all of our listeners. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I hope this was helpful, and look forward to connecting down the road on some other topic.
So, it'll be great to catch up again in the future.